Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Badan Warisan Malaysia's talk series. And I'd like to welcome you today. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, the topic is Sabah, Untold Stories of the Past by Avtar Singh. Avtar has spent over 20 years in the retail industry in Malaysia and began to transition to private historical research and writing in 2016. So he did his first historical talk in 2019 on the Battle of Midway. And he has also collaborated on debunking the false narrative of the Sulu Sultanate's claims over Sabah. And he's presented several historical papers on Sabah history. And he was born in Sabah and lives in Sabah as well. He has presented his findings to a national audience about the Sulu Sultanate. And this has helped our Malaysian government to challenge the claims over Sabah in the European courts. He is currently attached to the Goethe Institute of Germany as a private historical researcher, and he also produces his own podcast at Avtar Singh History, so you can follow him there. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome Avtar to begin his talk.
Hi, very good morning, everybody, and thank you for being a part of today's talk on Sabah, Untold Stories of the Past. Sabah has a very diverse culture and history, but before I get into that, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Badan Warisan Malaysia. I would like to thank the Council of Badan Warisan Malaysia. I would like to thank Vanessa Long, General Manager, as well as Shuhaida and the team for making it possible for me to present a little bit of Sabah history, untold stories to you today on a lovely Saturday. As a project researcher with the Goethe Institute of Malaysia, my object is to share history, to collaborate with our partners in Sarawak and also our partners in Sabah, and to try to bring you these stories that have not been told or talked about. There's a lot of Sabah history which many Malaysians still do not know about and do not understand. And so our role in this as project researchers and private researchers is to find as much as we can and to share the correct historical narratives that we have today. And as we've discovered. Now, I would like to give you a bit of the lay of the land of Sabah before I begin so that you have a bit of an idea of what I'm talking about if I do touch on certain districts or certain areas in Sabah before I get to the more sort of the heart of what I'm going to be talking about today. And so I will start. So this is a very basic map of Sabah with all the different districts in Sabah. And so just to give you a bit of the lay of the land of Sabah. So again, many of you have been to Kota Kinabalu possibly and to Mount Kinabalu, which is in the Ranau district. You may have been to Masilau as well. That's up in the plateau just below the foot of Mount Kinabalu. But Sabah is more than that. We have so many different districts with so many different indigenous ethnic groups and so forth. On the East Coast, we have the town of Ladatu, which is a palm oil hub for Sabah. You may have heard of Sampurna, which is sort of a stepping off point for you to go and dive in the islands around Sipadang and Mabul and Kapalai, for example, for those of you who are divers. And if you sort of move down south to Tawau, Tawau is the border town between Sabah and Kalimantan, Indonesia. So a lot of people migrate in and out of Tawau into Kalimantan to get to many different parts of Indonesia through Tawau. So it's a very important border town today, as it was decades and centuries ago. If you move to the heart of Sabah, that's Tongot, Nabawan, Keningau, Tenem, that's really the heart. We call it the interior whenever we talk about Sabah. So when we say interior, we're referring to these areas, and this is really where many of the sub-ethnic groups come from. We have quite a lot. Spitang is sort of our border with Sarawak and Brunei. So you need to drive down to Spitang, you cross the border, you're into Sarawak, and then of course you have to cross back into Brunei, which is Temburong, and then you cross out of Temburong to get to Limbang. So Lawas, Temburong, Limbang. So yeah, it's a little bit complicated. You need to show your passport when you go through these areas. So if you move along the coast, you'll see Labuan. Labuan is no longer a part of Sabah. To the federal government, 1984. And I lived in Labuan. I grew up in Labuan. So I have ties to the island as well. If you can look at the map, you'll see Brunei is just a little bit south of Labuan, across from what is today Sabah. And you move up along the west coast, you will find Papar, Beaufort, Kota Kinabalu, Tuaran, Kota Belud, and then all the way up north, we have a little town, our last town to the north, Kudat. And to the north of two little islands, they don't have a name on them. So Pulau Bangi is a very important island, I think, in Malaysia today. And next to it is Pulau Bangi. So, sorry, Pulau Balambangan. And so that sort of gives you a little bit of an idea. It's incidentally, if you look at the Beluran district next to Ranau district, it's one of the poorer districts, quite remote, but I think the government is doing a lot to try and improve the situation there. So I'll just move on to my next slide, and we have quite a lot to cover today. So this simple map, if you look to the south in particular, you will note that I've put the Baram River, which is today in Sarawak. So there are some beliefs that there was a migration from the Baram River to the north into what is today due to conflict and displacement. To the north of the Baram River is Brunei and Lawas, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. And if you look, you'll see Barrio, which is sort of the Kelabit highlands, the highlands for the Kelabit ethnic group. And they are a very famous headhunting group that fought the Japanese in the Second World War. And the bigger question, which I always get asked all the time, so, why are there so many problems on the east coast of Sabah in the old days, where we had piracy and so forth in the old days? Because of the proximity of the east coast of Sabah to the southern Philippine Islands. So this map gives you a bit of an idea. I use this map for discussions on piracy and kidnapping in the 17th century and 18th century, the old days, before the Europeans arrived and before North Borneo became a part of the North Borneo Chartered Company. So I also have talked about that in the past, but we're not talking about that today. Interest to you. So this is the Rumanau tribe. They still exist today. You may find them in the Tongon area, sort of the heart, right in the middle of Sabah today. And so Sabah's population is made up of about 33 indigenous groups, and we communicate in over 50 languages. And there are 80 ethnic dialects from this. That's how complicated it is. Whilst the Kadazans, the Dusuns, the Muruts, and the Rungus, we call them KDMR. It's sort of a short form for identifying somebody who comes from with an indigenous background, as being the largest ethnic group of all the ethnic groups in Sabah. They make up about 35 to 40% of the population of Sabah. And you may not have heard of other ethnic groups, such as the Kedayans, the Tidungs, the Bruneians, of course, but they are part of North Borneo and Sabah. The Lundayu, but in Sarawak, we call them Lunbawang. The Rungus, the Dayaks, and we have Dayaks even from Sarawak who have migrated and settled in Sabah in the old days before the British arrived. The Kelabit, the Idahans, and the Tatanas. We have many others. Well, now, while Sabah has been a land of migration for over 1,000 years, possibly longer, Sabah today also comprises of many different other ethnic groups and peoples who make up the people of Sabah. We have such a great cultural diversity here. spread far and wide across the state, where intermarriages has been a norm for centuries, and it has, I think, become so common that sharing traditions and festivals has become a norm as well. So the Harvest Festival just finished last week for the whole month of May, and it's one of the joyous moments in Sabah history, Sabah culture. We all look forward to it, a time to celebrate and to come together. And I'll talk a bit about the Harvest Festival shortly. The other thing also I wish to point out is Sabah also has a sizable immigrant group or migrated group that came into Sabah over the last few hundred years. We had migrations from Kalimantan, what is today Kalimantan, southern Borneo, eastern Borneo, Sulawesi, Java, Timor, the Philippines, alongside the Hakkas, the Hainese, Cantonese who have migrated into Sabah well before Malaysia was formed, more than 100 to 150 to 200 years. So the Chinese community here has been present for the longest time. It's not a recent migration, some people may think. And of course, the Indians, we've had the Indian migration here, specifically going back about 1,500 years ago. And I'll talk very briefly about that as well, the arrival of the Indians and Hinduism in the Kutai kingdom in East Kalimantan. So some indigenous groups still maintain their original cultures, their traditions, their beliefs, and remember their history annually. And this is celebrated as our annual Harvest Festival for the entire month of May, which again, as I mentioned, it just ended last week. So it was a month of celebration for us in Sabah. So what is its origins and how did it all begin? And it really, really begins with the great sacrifice of Huminodon. Now, the Harvest Festival in Sabah is an annual month-long celebration ending in a carnival-like party, usually now on the 30th and 31st of May every year. So that date is fixed in the calendar every year. And it has deep cultural roots. They go back centuries as a time of celebration and dance and the gathering of communities during what we call the annual Pesta Keamatan. And it's tied directly to the early rice cultivation of the peoples of Sabah and in both legends and folklore. Now, in the old days, and the people didn't have religions, they were animists. And so animist indigenous groups once believed that everything in the world around us had a spirit. And so offerings were often made to show gratitude. And after a successful harvest of paddy, this included, spirits in certain types of rocks, rivers, trees, and anything that abnormal that was different from the norm. So they would believe that these things would have spirits in them. As the indigenous groups transitioned from being purely hunter-gatherers or nomadic hunters of thousands of years ago to having learned to farm and to plant rice and to harvest rice, this may have led to the early beginnings of the Keamatan celebrations. The people feared that if they didn't fulfill their obligations to the spirits would be angry and might leave. And in turn, this would cause great hardships to the communities, which may even include famines and drought or endless monsoon rains that would destroy the crops. And so crops in the old days were harvested only once a year and then stockpiled as surplus to last for the rest of the year. So if you have a period of famine, drought, or extreme rain and flooding, that could potentially mean no rice for the entire community, which may have led to starvation, as rice is still, even till today, an essential part of our daily staple diet, as is the case throughout Southeast Asia. Now, the Humidon character is a legendary character based on a young female maiden And it's been told through folklore stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, and amongst the Dusun people primarily. According to legend, Humidodon was a maiden who was sacrificed to feed her famine-stricken community, her people, and her original name was Ponompuan. Now, the legend tells us that once upon a time, the land became infertile for some reason, and that they could not grow any rice. And her father learned that the only way to overcome this famine or this disaster was to sacrifice his daughter. Now, Penumpuan willingly accepted her father's will, as she understood that her great sacrifice would save her community from starvation. And she was given this legendary name of Hominodon. And she was sacrificed by her father. She fulfilled the promise to her people and saved them. And when her spirit emerged from a large jar where we traditionally used to keep bodies, we would store them in jars, and sometimes we would bury the jars. The general belief is that her spirit emerged from the jar, and as a result of her sacrifice, the people were saved, and there was a bountiful harvest as a result of her sacrificing herself. And so that leads us to the next thing, which is the celebration of Hominodon and Podopuan as well, which we have now as the Unduk Andau competition during the Harvest Festival. So some of you may be aware, and have this idea that it's a beauty contest of some sort, where you have all these beautiful young maidens lined up on a stage and they walk very nicely like a beauty contest. And it's not really the case. The whole point of it is not that. It gives each district, each community, the ability to send the very best against other ladies from other communities to showcase the very best of their culture and their community to the world. Now, it's a sharing of culture, it's a sharing of traditions for that community. And so the maiden that represents them would be dressed gracefully in traditional costumes, representing her ethnic community. She would project her natural self, portray the best virtues, and try to resemble the great Hominodon, and to also perhaps represent love, compassion, and sacrifice. So all these things are sort of part of the whole Unduk Adau competition. It's not a beauty contest. It looks like a beauty contest, but it's not. The other important aspect is to remember culture and traditions and to be able to speak mother tongue. So if, let's say, you're a Murut, you would be asked questions about your culture, and you would have to answer in Murut clearly and confidently as well. So the same for somebody who's a Kadazan from, let's say, Pidampang, you'd have to answer in Kadazan fluently, and you'd have to explain yourself well as an answer to a question given by a panel of judges. So that's how it is. So this year in Annam, which is a small district, a small sub-district just at the side nearby to the Mount Kinabalu area that separates Kota Kinabalu and Mount Kinabalu. We have a mountain range just nearby, which we call Coco Hill. So Inanam sits just below it and also on the opposite side. So this young lady has won on behalf of the Inanam people. So it's a very proud day for Sabahans. We all look forward to the event every year. It's sort of the highlight of the whole thing for us to end the Harvest Festival celebrations. And so, whilst there is little evidence on Sabah history in writing and scriptures, up to the 18th century, we in Sabah have been able to sort of piece together parts of a large jigsaw puzzle, and if I may use that analogy, with regards to some migration patterns, establishment of systems of administration, a simple form of government that was established by the Sultanate of Brunei over the coastal regions of Sabah, trade, which in turn brought technologies such as the use of firearms and cannons in war, and as well as seedlings for planting of rubber, coffee, tobacco, as well as the export of jungle products from North Borneo to the greater world outside of Borneo. There are limited Chinese scriptures and records that have helped us have a better understanding of some of the important aspects of Sabah Brunei history, going back to the 5th century, based on records of trade, diplomacy, and visitation to Borneo by Chinese traders, merchants, and diplomats. There is significant Indian influence to be found in Borneo, especially in the southeast of the region, which was formerly the Kingdom of Kutai, where sacrificial posts and pillars have been found, and it dates back to the 4th century. 2 Buddhist inscriptions have been found in Brunei in recent times, which relate to karma and rebirth. And we're sort of, in Sabah, we're sort of dependent heavily on Brunei and Sarawak history to sometimes help us fill up this missing pieces in this big jigsaw puzzle that we're trying to put together on Sabah history. And it takes time. It's a slow process. And there are many people who came before me who have done fantastic work to tell Sabah history, but we still have a lot of things that we still yet to discover about Sabah history, which is what we do every day now, is to try and put together correct narrative on Sabah history and to share it as well. Historical narratives have changed over time, and we've learned to be less dependent on European historical narratives. The more we research and the more we read, the better we are also at understanding Chinese scriptures, storytelling, folklore, and recordings, the better we have a better understanding of the world that is long gone in Sabah. And we're able to sort of put together a better and more accurate understanding of Sabah history today, which is what I do with a number of my other research partners today as well. Now, the map that I'm sharing with you, okay, it's a very boring map, doesn't really tell us anything, but what I'm trying to project to you is that the world that once existed in Borneo was a borderless world. If you can imagine Borneo 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, the reality was that there were no countries, there were no official borders, and you end up with this kind of map. People could migrate as they wanted, where they wanted, when they wanted. There were no territories, there were no kingdoms that we sort of know about until probably the establishment of the Kutai kingdom on the eastern side of what is Borneo and Kalimantan today. Prior to that, we have no record to tell us of any kingdoms that existed prior to that, or even during that period of time. So, for example, Malaysia was only formed in 1963. I think you all know that. But only when a merger between individual territories happened. So you have Malaya, you have Singapore, Sarawak, and Borneo all coming together to form a new border, a Malaysian border. So that's a very good example to use as far as how borders can and do involve and how they do suddenly appear out of the blue that it's a new nation, new country. And so Borneo was once a borderless world. Individual kingdoms, empires, clans, indigenous tribes projected their sphere of influence by the size of its community, their ability to have the manpower and strength to fight rivals, and also by the size of its navy and the size of its army, or a combination of both. It's perhaps through trade, wealth, and commerce that a small kingdom would suddenly grow in size and influence and could project itself. It could influence with the use of a small army or a large army and navy, or it could use diplomacy as a method of diplomacy to collect tribute, payments of tribute to maintain the status quo of friendly ties with a neighbor, and to continue trade and commerce, and wealth would then come about as a result of trade. And this, I think, benefited everybody rather than a few. This also ensured that by paying tribute, a small territory or a city or a port, its people and its kingdom would not be destroyed by a rival. They could still continue to trade and have commerce, and they could both benefit from it. as long as tribute was paid. Now, this also allowed kingdoms that evolved, such as the Funan kingdom, Sriwijaya kingdom, Majapahit kingdom, and also Malacca as well, to project influence over an area, a territory, a region, or even a waterway as well, like the Malacca Straits. Migration today was as common as it was 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 or even 2,000 years ago. Migration has been happening for the longest period of time. It's not something new. It's not a new concept. And sometimes we get sort of stuck in this belief that people never moved around, never traveled and so forth. But that's not the case. We tend to sometimes fall into this notion that borders today existed centuries ago, and people were only in one location. They never moved, never shifted, and that's simply not true. Wars, famine, drought, environmental events such as volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis were a norm in the world in the past. And outside of Sabah and also along the coasts of Sabah for over 2 centuries. So that's something we have to sort of accept. People have been moving around, shifting, moving around. Communities did move. Even today, we look at the world around us. You just have to look at the news every day. There's war, there's famine, there's drought, there's climate change now, new word. There's unemployment. People are moving to seek employment in other countries, other districts, other towns. Due to a lack of income to survive, it's led to what we call displacement and forced migration for millions around the world today. You just have to look at the number of people migrating into Europe today, for example, or even Malaysia from neighboring countries that are politically unstable. Myanmar being an example today of political instability. And you'll see a common theme actually exists today as it did in the past. In the past, as is today, people and communities moved as they pleased when it was possible, sometimes into territories or areas that other native ethnic groups or indigenous peoples lived. Sometimes they lived in peace, they coexisted, and other times they didn't. They went to war with each other, which is also the case today as well. Of course, today we have borders, we have passports when we want to travel into Thailand or Singapore or Brunei or so forth. In those days, there was no such thing. People could migrate and move as long as they could peacefully coexist with each other. And then you have intermarriages that would happen between these different communities. Communities did intermarriage. And so you have new generations of people of mixed ethnic backgrounds, which is the case in Sabah. So one of the lesser known things about Sabah history is the fact that Brunei ruled over Sabah for over 500 years. It's a fact. It's something that it has been acknowledged. It is factually correct, but we don't really talk about it in Malaysia, which is a bit of a pity, but it is what it is. So we believe that Brunei rule sort of existed from 1485 onwards until 1877. So this map that I've created and I'm sharing with you now basically demonstrates Brunei's sphere of influence at its highest point, when its strongest point, when it had a large navy and a large army. And so Brunei ruled over the Philippines, and that's something that people don't really know about. Brunei did. Brunei was an empire, albeit for a short period of time before the Spanish arrived. And this influence over Philippines and Sabah continued until the Spanish arrived, and it may have occurred as a result of the decline of the Majapahit Empire. So as the Majapahit Empire declines in sphere of influence and power, Brunei, as a tribute payer, comes out of it and merely takes over and starts collecting taxes and tributes from all those communities that were previously paying taxes to the Majapahit. So that's what we believe transpired. Brunei actually established Manila, the city of Manila that we know today. It's actually established by the Brunei Sultanate. And the island of Pahlawan and Balabac in the Philippines, the southern Philippines, which sort of separate, there's these little islands in between Sabah and the Philippines. You have Pahlawan and Balabac. They used to be a part of the Brunei Sultanate, and they used to be part of Sabah as well. And so that's why I include Brunei in most of my maps that I talk about historically when we do presentations on Sabah history. Now, why else do we include Brunei in the historical context? It is the Brunei Sultanate that appears to have the most influence along the coastlines of Sabah. Now, we have to be a bit careful. There's this false narrative that gets repeated, and I'm sure many of you are very aware that there's a claim by certain individuals in the Philippines over Sabah, that they own Sabah and so forth. So a lot of people are confused about that. I won't talk about that today. But what I will talk about is the fact that Brunei had influence along the coastlines of Sabah, but not in the interior, the heartland of Sabah, where the natives and the indigenous groups lived. The Dusuns, the Rungus and the Muruts and the Lun Bawang, where they lived, the headhunters lived. They owed no loyalty to anybody but themselves or the chieftains or their own leaders, community leaders. They were not aligned with Brunei, and they were certainly not conquered by anybody. So that's one thing we have to be very clear about when we talk about Sabah history. Sometimes you see a map from the Philippines and it'll claim half of Sabah straight across, and that's simply not true. The Bruneians also acknowledged that as well. The rule was merely coastline. And so it was common in the old days for Bruneians, the Brunei Sultanate, to recruit indigenous natives, to serve in their army or navy, to expand their sphere of influence over all of Borneo. And so all of Borneo were tribute payers to the Brunei Sultanate for a period of time once the Majapahit Empire declines. And of course, all this changes when the Spanish arrive. The Spanish conquer the Philippines. Brunei then declines in sphere of influence, and all these kingdoms unite together. Brunei unites with the Islamic kingdoms, and there are many Islamic kingdoms in the southern Philippines, together with Aceh, Sultan of Aceh, together with the Turks, the Ottomans. They all come together to fight the Spanish, and that's sort of the mid 1500s or so. So there is a lot of things that we don't talk about, we're not aware about, but this is how it was in the old days. And so when Brunei declines in sphere of influence, its control is merely along the coastlines of Sabah. It loses the Philippines. It loses control over the southern Philippine islands, where it used to collect tribute. So there is a strong belief in Sabah, as far as historians are concerned, that Brunei would also recruit war veterans, what we would call Orang Laut or Orang Selat, from what is today Singapore, as well as the Riau Islands that sit just south of Singapore as well. And they migrated into what is Sabah today to serve the Brunei Sultanate. Very experienced seafarers, very experienced veterans of war on ships at sea. They became the backbone of the Brunei Navy under the Brunei Sultanate. And many of these communities settled along the coastlines of Sabah and established communities along the coastlines of Sabah. They, more often than not, they intermarried with indigenous groups that already pre-existed, and new communities were formed. And some of these communities even still exist till today. If you were to rent a car and you were to drive along the coast to, let's say, Shangri-La Rasaria Resort, you would go over a really large bridge over a waterway, and you'd come to the village of Mengkebong. Mengkebong is believed to be a very important historical village as far as the Bajau are concerned, the Orang Laut or the Orang Selat from Singapore. And then you have places like Tuaran, which was spelled very different in the old days, and Sembulan, which is actually right opposite the Sutra Harbor Resort, the little village of Sembulang. That was established by the Bajau as well. Tanjung Aru Beach. Many of you may have been to the beach at Tanjung Aru, just near the airport, Kota Kinabalu International Airport. Tanjung Aru was established as a Bajau village as well during the era of the Brunei Sultanate. And the water villages still exist even till today. Now, the one thing the Bruneians were very smart at doing was that they introduced a system, a river administration system that allowed for the establishment of a taxation system along all the rivers in Sabah. So every single river in Sabah belonged either to the Sultan of Brunei or his Temenggung. Every river. How do we know this? Because we actually, when the British acquired Sabah from Overbeck and Dent, the two Europeans that purchased Sabah from the Brunei Sultanate, all of Sabah, you have land titles that have been issued, agreements that have been issued for all these rivers. So that's how Brunei controlled, and that's how they established their footprint throughout the coastlines of Sabah. So we actually have every single agreement, every single document that was signed between the Europeans and the Brunei Sultanate and the Temenggung. And so we also know the amount of money that was paid every year. It's in excess of $25,000 a year to the Brunei Sultanate to give up all claims over the coastlines of Sabah and the interior of Sabah. Now, the other thing I want to point out before I go to the next slide is Sabah history is intertwined with Sarawak and Brunei history. You cannot escape that fact because of this borderless world that I talked about earlier. One cannot separate one from the other when we talk about Sabah history. And it's been incredibly useful for us as historians and researchers today, as we're able to place a period of the 15th or 16th century when this river tax system was established because of Brunei records. And so this helps us to better understand some aspects of history in that period of time. It also gives us a very good idea of how the system worked, the system of collecting taxes. So before I end this particular slide on Brunei, why did Brunei give up? Why did Brunei decide to give up all claims of ownership over Sabah in 1877? It's a very common question. And the answer is very simple. Brunei suffered from European influence. The Portuguese and the Dutch. The Portuguese had a good relationship with Brunei when they controlled Malacca, but when the Dutch arrived, they introduced trade policies that essentially killed Brunei as a very important trading post, as they did with many other important river and sea trading ports as well. Dutch policies made it impossible for these kingdoms to continue to operate or to function, as they were simply not generating enough wealth. And now, when you don't have coin in your treasury, you don't have the ability to pay your army or your navy or to purchase goods, and you become a poorer sultanate, you start to lose influence. And that's what happened with Brunei for the most part, because the Europeans destroyed the established trade system that had pre-existed the Europeans. And that's how many of the kingdoms collapsed in the mid to late 1900s. I beg your pardon, mid to late 1800s. The trade world. We tend to get stuck in the narrative that only Malacca existed, and only Malacca was the only trading post in Malayan history, and that's simply not true. Many trading posts pre-existed Malacca, and the world of China and all these territories within Southeast Asia was interconnected with India, Africa, Arabia, Persia, and even beyond to Rome and what is now Greece as well. Trade had pre-existed well before the 1st century. So I won't talk about it today, but I'm just trying to give you a bit of an idea of the world around Borneo and how important trade was to many communities and how items moved around from one region across to the other. Merchants were traveling back and forth every year to sell their products. And many, many wholesale markets existed within Southeast Asia. As this sort of chart sort of shows, many pre-existed from the old days, even before the Europeans arrived. So the next topic I'd like to talk about related to Sabah history is migration. External migration into North Borneo of a kingdom. Now, the Funan kingdom was an ancient state or kingdom in what is today Indochina that arose in the 1st century and was incorporated in the state of Chenla in the 6th century. It was a Hinduized or Hindu kingdom, heavily influenced by traders from India, merchants from India. And it covered an area today that includes regions within Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia. Now, the Funan had trade relations with India as well as China, and whose emperor sent payments of tribute to the emperor of China between the 3rd and the 6th century. I shouldn't have used the word emperor for the Funan kingdom, it's king. Whereas the emperor for China, of course, is an emperor. So I do apologize for that. Archaeological evidence shows that the Funan was heavily influenced by Indian cultures and religions today. That has been excavated and found to be true. But the next question you're probably asking is, so what does this have to do with Sabah and the greater North Borneo region? Right. For this, I refer to the archaeological work and research in historical writings of G. Codes, specifically from his writings in the origins of the Salindras. I also refer to the research and writings of Robert Nicole, formerly of the Brunei Museum, who presented research papers in the 1970s and early 1980s. And I also refer to discovery of ancient Buddhist tablets that exist in Brunei today. Now, Codis has suggested this mass migration. There was a mass migration from Indochina in the 7th century, around 680 AD, by members of the Funan kingdom, the Funan royal household, who were either forced to escape or to migrate willfully to the west coast of North Borneo. And so the scriptures tell us that they migrated and established a kingdom south of Mount Kinabalu, along what we believe to be the Lawas River, which exists today as the town of Lawas, but in Sarawak. Now, this is located right next to the Sabah border. Now, why did the Funan migrate? It may have been due to internal civil war. It may have been internal misunderstandings within the dynasty. There may have been weather-related reasons why there was a decline. Maybe there was a decline in wealth and trade as well. And it allowed the neighbors to then replace them in the kingdom itself, the areas that they ruled. It's also possible that the peoples of the Funan kingdom who migrated to North Borneo may have brought their customs and traditions with them, and they may have intermarried with the indigenous people who lived along the coastlines and the highlands of North Borneo. So that's a theory there. Now, whilst Hodis and Nicole have suggested Lawas as a site of what we now come to know as Poni, other historians have suggested it may have been the vicinity of a town that exists today further south known as Limbang. So if you look at the map that I'm sharing with you, you will note where Bandar Sri Begawan is. That's the capital of Brunei. And if you look directly across, you'll see Poni and Lawas. Now, This area is just to the north of Bandar Sri Begawan and Poni, is known as the Brunei Bay, which extends all the way into Lawas. And then if you look a little bit further south, you'll see Poni and Limbang. So I've actually indicated Lawas and Limbang as Poni because there is an argument that Limbang may have been the site of Poni, though Codis and Nicole suggest that it's Lawas. I tend to believe it's Lawas because of the geographic descriptions that had been given in Chinese scriptures. But again, I keep an open mind, and I prefer to keep an open mind until we can attain more evidence to help argue the case for Limbang or Bandar Sri Begawan, because as far as Brunei is concerned, only one kingdom existed, and that's Brunei. It wasn't Bandar Sri Begawan, it was just known as Brunei. It was also known as Borneo as well. Somebody has suggested that it was also known as Boni, but it may be a little bit difficult to argue the case for Boni because the kingdom of Boni has been found in other regions in Sulawesi and in Java. So it may not necessarily have been Brunei. Anyways, that's a complicated argument. I won't get into it today, but that gives you a little bit of an idea of how confusing sometimes when somebody says a word to you. Where are you from? Okay, I am from, and they're trying to communicate in languages that they don't understand. How one person perceives pronunciation of a word and how it's actually recorded as spelled may not come out as how it actually is. So that's a complicated matter in itself. But for this talk, I'll refer to Lawas as Poni and Brunei as Brunei or Old Brunei. Brunei was, as I said, originally known as Brunei or even Borneo as well. We've seen writings in journals where they actually refer to Brunei specifically as Borneo. The king of Borneo is in Brunei. So we've seen that writing from European explorers. And so pre-Islamic periods and post-Islamic periods of the Brunei Sultanate is referred to Brunei as Borneo. As far as its presentation is concerned, as I said, I'll refer to Poni as being in Lawas, and I'll refer to Brunei as Old Brunei in this particular talk, so that you don't get confused. Now, the exact date of when Brunei became a sultanate is still a source of debate. The Brunei historians have their date fixed when they believe Brunei became a sultanate. And it evolved from a kingdom that had pre-existed. It was a pagan kingdom, an animistic kingdom that had already existed for several generations. So it was not a newly formed sultanate. It had already existed before, but we just don't know when it was formed. And if Brunei and this Poni kingdom coexisted together, or if Brunei evolved from Poni, or if Poni never existed at all and it was merely Brunei that existed and that the Funan migrated into Brunei, we just simply don't know historically or factually. The next map is interesting. If you look at this archaeological survey map of southern Cambodia and southern Vietnam today, this particular map comes from the Vietnam Museum. You will note all the many different archaeological sites that exist today, possibly from the period of the Funan kingdom. And it tells us that many ports existed along many rivers along the waterways that went deep into the heart of these territories. They were not seaports, they were river ports, which is very interesting because if you look at where Bandar Sri Begawan exists today, and where Lawas exists today, so Brunei is what I've indicated as BSB. So from the mouth of the river, it's 12.9 kilometers inland, all right, down a river. Limbang is located 15 kilometers upriver or downriver from the mouth of the Brunei Bay. And if you look all the way to the right, you will note that Lawas is almost 19 kilometers inland from the mouth of the Brunei Bay. So very similar to what you see in the archaeological map I'd shown you earlier. Hindu Buddhist items were discovered in the 1960s in Limbang by Tom and Barbara Harrison. And these items currently are in possession of the Brunei Museum. Now, it's difficult, as I said, to ascertain if Ponyi pre-existed the establishment of Old Brunei, or if the Old Brunei had already pre-existed before Ponyi was established along the Lawas River, or that they simply coexisted, or that Brunei evolved out of Ponyi. We just don't know, even now. So I would like to talk a little bit about, there's one thing I'd like to share with you. Let me just go back. Let me just go back one slide up here. Now, in the early 1500s, a Portuguese writer that visited Brunei, and he was part of the Magellan expedition. So Magellan gets killed in the Philippines. And so his expedition continues. And they arrive in Brunei, and a guy called Antonio Pigafetta records what he sees when he arrives in Brunei. Right? So he arrives in the area of Brunei, which is sort of to the north, the entrance into the Brunei Bay. Muara exists today as well. And what he sees is very fascinating. He actually witnesses a war party, a naval war party of Bruneians going off to attack a pagan community across the Brunei Bay. Now, we believe that this can only be Ponyi, the pagan kingdom that they refer to. And this is the only writing that exists between that particular recording and now of anybody mentioning about this other kingdom on the other side of the Brunei Bay, which we believe to be Ponyi. And we believe that at the end of this particular war, the Ponyi kingdom was destroyed. That is the general belief. And so only one writing exists up to the early 1500s. And we are sort of a bit grateful that Pigafetta recorded what he saw, what he observed. It was more than 100 war crafts going off to attack this pagan kingdom across the Brunei Bay. And so that may very well have been the end of the Ponyi kingdom that influenced Sabah on the west coast. So I'd like to talk a little bit about something a little bit different, something interesting. Mount Kinabalu, as you know, is part of the Crocker Range Mountains. It's a mountain range that extends along the west coast, from the west coast until the interior of Sabah. You can see Tenem at the bottom there. That's the heart of Sabah. And if you go all the way to the north of this mountain range, you will see Ranau, Tuaran. So Mount Kinabalu sits at the top, right? And that's sort of the start of the Crocker Range Mountains. And that's significant historically as well for us. What does Mount Kinabalu and the Crocker Range and the Ponyi Kingdom have in common? Well, Codes refers to Chinese scriptures about the Ponyi Kingdom because the Crocker Range Mountains of today are referred to as the Mountains of Camphor. This may suggest that camphor was attained from the jungles of the Crocker Range Mountains and was traded as a vital commodity. Now, I'm sure many of you are sort of scratching your head going, what is camphor? I've not heard of this product before. What is it? Camphor is a relatively unknown jungle product or commodity to most people even till today. Most historians have not heard about it or known about it, but it was a vital commodity of trade for the people of North Borneo and Sabah and Brunei for over 1,000 years. It was a much sought after jungle product by Arab, Chinese, and Indian merchants. It was so valuable and so much in demand. It essentially is an organic product, an organic compound that is commonly used in creams, ointments, and lotions. Camphor oil is extracted from the wood of a camphor tree. It's sort of processed through a process of distillation through steam, and then it is used as an ointment or cream to relieve pain, irritation, itching, chest congestion, or inflammatory conditions, as well as aching muscles. Okay, so you're sort of thinking now, could be a number of things. We have similar products like that today that sort of solve everything. But what's interesting is by the 5th century, the price of Borneo camphor was on par with the price of gold, according to Chinese scriptures and records, and which is fascinating. How can a cream or ointment be so valuable that it was equivalent to the price of gold during that period in the 5th century? And so I must state that this jungle product was not exclusive only to Borneo or Sabah or the Crocker Range Mountains. Camphor could be found throughout Southeast Asia. There were 3 types of camphor that I've discovered in readings. You have camphor from Southeast Asia, you have camphor from China and Japan, and then finally you have camphor specifically from Borneo, Malaya, and Sumatra. Now, the Borneo camphor was much sought after, and it had a far greater value than all the other camphors from other that were traded at other port cities within Southeast Asia. And so in the records, the Crocker Range Mountains and the Baram Basin. Now, if you remember earlier, I talked about the Baram Basin, just south of Brunei and Lawas. So the Baram Basin and the Crocker Range Mountains become valuable areas where to attain this particular jungle product. Now, you're still sort of thinking, okay, this sounds familiar. I may know this product. I may not know this product. Have I used it before? You have. You probably have. Let me introduce you to the plant. This is the camphor plant. And let me introduce you to the product that you may have heard about called Vicks, which many of you may have had in your homes as a young child growing up. Your parents may have kept a little statue of Vicks when you had a chest infection, you had fever or a bad cold. You may have had swollen ankles or knees or so forth. It's basically a mixture today of camphor, menthol, and eucalyptus oil. Some of you still use it when you have congestion of the sinuses as well. So it still is used today. It is not traded, to my knowledge, from Borneo anymore, or even Sabah. Nobody talks about it. So it must be attained from other regions in the world, unfortunately, but not Sabah. Mount Kinabalu, to finish off today's talk, I'd just like to talk very briefly about the significance of Mount Kinabalu. So this image is taken from Pekan Nabalu. So if you're driving from Kota Kinabalu to get to Kondasang or to Masilau, you have to pass through this little village called Nabalu, which has this magnificent view of Mount Kinabalu on a clear day. And so Mount Kinabalu itself is tied to many, many animistic beliefs of the indigenous people of Sabah. Mount Kinabalu is a place where the souls of the dead would go and reside on the summit. Mount Kinabalu has become symbolic for the people of Sabah and the indigenous people of Sabah. And so if we look back in the past, all these ancient beliefs and so forth are tied directly to Mount Kinabalu. It's an ancestral resting place for the souls of the indigenous people, especially the Dusuns who live around Mount Kinabalu. And it still holds great reverence and importance in Sabah's cultural heritage, identity, as well as shaping the way the indigenous people view and interact with the mountain, even till today. If you sort of remember in 2015, early 2015, there was a story in the newspapers where a group of tourists went up Mount Kinabalu and then decided to take their clothes off as a little bit of a joke, a little bit of fun on the summit of the mountain, and then to photograph themselves or video themselves on the summit being naked. Young people being young people, they will do crazy things. I think we've all sort of done stuff like that before in our youth, but the people of Sabah were greatly offended and insulted, especially the indigenous leaders and the communities that lived around the mountain. They were very, very insulted by this. Of course, there was a little bit of a police case after that, and priests and priestesses, bobohizans, as we call them, were called to do prayers to appease the souls on the summit of Mount Kinabalu. Tragically, if you remember, an earthquake occurred not too long after, and lives were lost on the summit. It was a tragedy, but the one thing that I take from that is that we've never had an earthquake like that in recent memory, recent times. Maybe 100 years ago, maybe 500 years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, we may have had something similar, but otherwise we've never had an earthquake of that magnitude that caused that amount of damage and that amount of loss of life. So, you know, you can look at it from many different angles, but the people have their beliefs and we have to respect their beliefs as well. And so, thank you for allowing me today to present a little bit of Sabah Untold Stories to you. There are many more stories to share and talk about. Can't do it today, but I like to take this opportunity to thank Badan Warisan Malaysia, the council, Vanessa, and the team for welcoming me today to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avtar. I mean, it's really amazing to know that Sabah's past began many centuries ago, and you know, I mean, Sabah is known as the land below the wind, right? Negeri di bawah bayu. And I'd like to kick off. If any one of you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box or in the Q&A section for your questions. I'd like to ask you, Avtar. I mean, we kind of know that Sarawak was formed when Brunei lost the section on Sarawak to Raja Brooke, etc. So how was North Borneo established, and who owned or controlled it?
So, there's an overlapping claim. I'm sure all of you know about this thing. It's been in the newspapers quite a number of years now. It comes about because of overlapping claims of, you know, promises that were allegedly made in many centuries ago and so forth. And so, as the Brunei Sultanate, as I mentioned, declined in influence, they were also having problems collecting taxes, as well as the indigenous people who started migrating to the coastlines, and they were being taxed, refused to pay taxes. So you had little tribal and civil wars with Brunei tax collectors and the indigenous natives and peoples of the interior. And Brunei then had the opportunity to rid itself of all these problems when you had an Austrian diplomat and an English businessman offer them the opportunity to give up ownership over Sabah in exchange for yearly payments. And so they agreed, they signed the grant, what we call the grant of 1877. And they were paid $5,000 a year for these territories. And many agreements were signed over a period of 10 years. Many agreements were signed. It wasn't just one document, it's many documents. Because remember, they had to purchase all the individual rivers that existed where Brunei claimed to own, sort of like individual land titles or individual territories. So they had to purchase all of this. In the end, they were paying in excess of 25,000 a year. Now, why did they make this? Why did, you know, one of the confusing things that people have, Vanessa, is that, well, if they really did purchase the territory, why are they paying yearly rather than one lump sum payment? So what the Europeans were doing was that they couldn't raise the money at that time to pay what the Brunei Sultan wanted. So they came to an agreement like, look, why don't we just pay you every year? You give us the territory and we will manage it. We will look after it. You just collect the yearly payments we give you and everybody's happy. The one thing, this happens just after the Americans had signed something similar and acquired a 10-year lease from the Brunei Sultanate. So actually, Sabah was an American colony first. before it became a British colony. So the Americans were unsuccessful in their endeavors in setting up plantations and so forth. And so when these two gentlemen come along, Overbeck and Dent come along, they make this proposal. And it's, Sabah is really the last territory that's left that the Europeans have not acquired, because everything else has been taken by the Dutch, or it's been taken by the Portuguese, or the English. So Malaya, Singapore, Penang has all been taken. Then Sabah is the only one that's sort of left. So these guys rush in and grab it. Raja Brooke had wanted to acquire Sabah, but he never got the opportunity to do that. Charles Brooke, for a number of reasons. So it wasn't the Brooke number one, it's Brooke number two. He just didn't have the opportunity to do it. So and that's how things sort of evolved. How did the Sulu come about into this claim over Sabah? A promise was allegedly made in the 1600s that if you come and help us in this particular civil war that's going on in Brunei, we will give you either a portion or all of Sabah. No agreement exists to prove this claim. It's just word of mouth and so forth. So that's really where it all sort of starts. But yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that. You had mentioned that there were burials in jars. How do you think that came about?
It's one of
And
those
is it still
interesting,
practiced?
it's one of those interesting things, isn't it? The jars are significant in especially in Kadazan culture and Dusun culture. You don't really see it with a lot of the other ethnic groups within Sabah doing it, but you find it specifically with the Kadazan. So, for example, where I live, the area that I live, we have a museum just down the road where you have these jars that have been buried with the bones of people that had passed away. And you have these menhirs that have been established above these jars as well to signify where somebody is buried. This possibly has influence from China. I have not, unfortunately, had the opportunity to look further into this. There are people who have researched this, who are well learned on this particular topic, who probably understand this topic a lot better than I do. So I will leave it to them, I think, to probably talk about it. I would like to talk about it in a future episode, but my knowledge on this particular topic is very limited.
Okay, we have a question here from Kate. Are there still established connections between Sabah and the Philippines and Cambodia, Vietnam today?
So Cambodia, Vietnam, no, we don't. Now, the Philippine one is a complicated question. We have a sizable population within Sabah of people who have migrated from the Philippine Islands and the southern Philippines into Sabah that goes back well over 150 years. We actually have looked at population census, as an example, that was done in the late 1800s by the British in Sandakan and the East Coast, for example. What the different ethnic groups that existed on the East Coast of Sabah, how many people from these groups existed. So if you look at the East Coast of Sabah, it was sparsely populated. East Coast of Sabah had a very small population, grown number of people on the East Coast. And this is mainly primarily due to piracy and kidnapping. There existed a number of slave trading posts on some of the islands in the southern Philippines. So native villages on the East Coast and the West Coast of Sabah would get raided by pirates. People would be brought to these slave trading posts and sold into slavery. So that may explain why the population was so small. So in between the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, there has been war and conflict in the southern Philippines. And a lot of people have had to migrate and escape and were displaced as a result of this political instability. And so where would you go? In times of war in the Philippines, where would you go? The safe haven was always Sabah. So they would come to Sabah because they felt that they had historical ties, they had relatives who had already migrated before them here. And so Sabah has always been the place where people would escape to in times of war in the southern Philippines. The other thing I'll point out, if you have to remember, this particular region, the east coast of Sabah and the islands in the southern Philippines, have been an area of conflict that goes all the way back to the period when the Spanish arrived, sort of the mid 1500s. It's always been a place of conflict. And all these little kingdoms and sultanates have all been fighting against the Spanish for the longest period of time, for over 300 years. And then there was a lull. You have World War II that comes about in the early 1940s. Then there's a lull again. And then in the mid 1960s, late 1960s, another conflict erupts between the Philippine government and the peoples of the southern Philippines. And that's another different story. But it's been displacement. So, yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that, Avtar. Okay, Irene Wee has a question. Is there any information about the border of Sabah and Sarawak was established? How were the borders established? I mean, there's
Well,
no
yeah.
obvious mountain ranges, rivers, or watersheds.
So this was sort of agreed between the Dutch and the North Borneo Chartered Company. They actually went out and did topographic work and actually did demarking as well, where the border. So what they do is actually plant rocks, markers along the border regions to separate both sides of the border. So this was done in the I think the late 1800s or early 1900s. I'll have to look for that. I actually have the document and information of when it was done and how long it took to do. So they came to an agreement where the border regions would be that separated Sarawak from Sabah and Kalimantan. So yes, that was done, and they came to some sort of an agreement, and an agreement was signed about this well to respect each other's borders. So yes, we have that record, and I'll try to share it with Vanessa so that she can share it with you. If you'd like to drop Vanessa an email, I'll be more than happy to share it with us so she can give it to you.
I'll tell everyone more about this, how you can forward more questions to Avtar, okay? Chris Boyd has a question. Can you tell us a bit about tobacco cultivation in the 19th century in Sabah?
Tobacco, for the most part, I don't know enough about it. My research partner actually has better knowledge about this. That's sort of an area that he sort of specializes in, plantation, agriculture, and so forth. My research is mainly on conflict, displacement, borders, and the Sultanate of Brunei. So I wish I could answer that for you. So yeah, but if you'd like to send your questions in, I'll try and get my research partner to help answer that question for you.
There's a comment here from Andrew. This is a very well presented snapshot of the early history of Sabah. Sadly, our students do not come across this in their history books in school. Do you have anything to say about that?
I was asked this question a week ago in another history discussion, and it's true. I actually, what I did about a month ago, I actually went to a bookstore that supplies school books to primary and secondary schools in Sabah. And so I went to the guy that looked after the store and said, can I have every history book for secondary 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on Malaysian history, everything. So I purchased every book they had. And then I discovered that they actually have review books which you could buy separately to prepare for exams. And there were quite a number of different books. And what I found is the textbook that students were buying was significantly thinner. And then the review books were significantly thicker, with more content and so forth. So yeah, I didn't get a chance to buy the review books. So I bought the books that were offered to secondary school students. And when I went through the books, there was barely any mention of Sabah history. So you're right, Andrew. There is almost no mention of Sabah history, unfortunately, in school books. We hope to encourage, in time, our education department to talk about Sabah, to include Sabah history into the curriculum. What me and my research partner have done and just completed just late last year, we've actually created a timeline of history on the history of Sabah. We're sort of, I think he's editing it at the moment. It's in English, and we're planning to launch this book at the end of this year, and then to get funding to get it translated into Bahasa Malaysia as well. So we're hoping to share it. And we're hoping that this book can, at some point in time, be introduced into primary education first. And if that's successful, then we're looking at secondary school education books then. So it's a very slow process. And you have to remember, it's also very political as well. Sabah, we don't control our education system, our education curriculum. We fall under the federal government. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Avtar. Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
Sorry.
There's a question here from Casper.
Yes.
Along the establishment and development of Sabah, how has it benefited the local indigenous community compared to the outside powers?
In what sense?
I guess I'm guessing here that compared to the influences of previous European or Bruneian influences, after Sabah was established, how has it since benefited the local community?
Okay. I am going to break it into 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to break it into 4 parts, my answer to your question. During the Brunei Sultanate period, the communities had established some form of trade system, barter trade system, where they would carry their jungle products to coastal or river towns or villages to barter trade with products as other essential products. But it didn't really end this cycle of poverty. We get to the period where the Europeans have arrived, and you have the North Borneo Chartered Company that has established itself in North Borneo. So what do? They try to get business up and running. So they try to encourage the opening of plantations. They start introducing infrastructure, building roads and a rail system to be able to carry out jungle products from certain villages and towns on the west coast of Sabah to the port in Jesselton, which is now Kota Kinabalu. That rail line still exists till today. You could get on a train in Kota Kinabalu and go all the way into the heartland, the interior, to a town called Tenem. So that was a very valuable investment. There were plans to extend that railway line, but it never happened for a number of reasons. So that's the west coast. In the interior, for the most part, people lived in poverty. There was no development, no growth. On the east coast of Sabah, where the town of Sandakan was established as the second capital of North Borneo, Kudat was first. It didn't work out, so they established Sandakan. Before Jesselton was established, Sandakan became a very important trade hub on the east coast of Sabah. But again, people for the most part lived in poverty. They exchanged jungle products for items that they needed, cloth and so forth. But it didn't really stop the cycle of poverty. Now we enter the third phase that I talked about, and that is just after the end of the Second World War, where the British government, the colonial power government, has taken over North Borneo. They've purchased North Borneo from the North Borneo Chartered Company. The North Borneo Chartered Company could not afford to pay for the repairs and redevelopment of infrastructure that was destroyed during the Second World War. Now, the colonial government that took over had a major task to do. They had big headaches. They had to rebuild all our towns in all of Sabah, because every single town in Sabah was flattened during the Second World War. Now, there's a sort of narrative that the Japanese did it. No, it actually was the Allies that went and bombed and destroyed all our towns. So they had to rebuild every single town. But one of the benefits of the British colonial government is that they established a much more significant educational presence in every major town throughout Sabah. So they began that process. They expanded it. Education became important. They expanded infrastructure. Trade grew significantly. More people were hired to work as clerks and in administrative roles in government. So they actually began that process of trying to get natives out of poverty, but it wasn't enough. Malaysia comes about, Malaysia is formed. It's only after Malaysia is formed that we have gotten out of that cycle of poverty. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think where we are today is significantly better than where we were during the colonial periods. But I'll make a caveat here. Where would Sabah be if it remained under the Brunei Sultanate or the Sulu Sultanate if they actually had a claim over Sabah and the colonial powers didn't come in? If you look at what the colonial powers brought in 1881 onwards, they brought education. It was the missionaries that spread education and built schools. A number of Islamic schools were established by native chiefs. There was some medicine and small little clinics that were established, but not enough. Infrastructure that was developed. Jobs were created in plantations. There was migration of workers from China into North Borneo to work in these plantations. So, but if you look overall, if it wasn't for the colonial powers, one may argue that Sabah would not be where it is today. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your comments and questions. I think we would like to conclude Avtar's talk. Thank you so much, Avtar, for such an illuminating talk on Sabah's past. I mean, this is such a learning experience for me, as with many of our audience, I'm sure, to learn about all this information of the rich history of Sabah that has spanned centuries. Yeah. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And Badan Warisan Malaysia is a non-government organization, and we do not receive any support from the government. So if you're happy with today's presentation and would like to support us, we welcome donations. They're tax exempt, and the information is available there on the screen. So again, thank you so much again for joining us, everyone. Today, we've enjoyed this lovely morning here and a very informative talk by Avtar. Avtar, thank you so much again. And we wish everyone a lovely weekend.